Is coming to us from the University of Berkeley, where she's a PhD candidate. She was born and raised in Sweden, did your master's in Egyptology and osteology, correct, at the University of Stockholm in 2001, moved to Berkeley and married Kevin and started her studies there. She works both with two excavations, one at Hebert, and one is one of the largest and most exciting excavations in Egypt associated with the Giza Plateau and the workman's village there and the cemetery there. And she's the chief osteologist for both of those projects.
No, just Giza.
Oh, just Giza.
Yeah, Robert's the one in.
Oh, that's right, Robert Yogi. Okay, so I lied. I do that on occasion. But and as well, she runs the field school at the American Research Center in Egypt and the very long name that they created for the Giza project. What's that called again?
Ancient Egypt Research Associates.
Yeah, those two groups put on a field school to train Egyptian inspectors in osteology, and Jessica runs that workshop and field school as well. So, with that introduction, we'll look forward to hearing from Jessica.
Oh, I lost my microphone. Maybe I'll just do this. Okay. How did I turn this down?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was supposed to do that. The AV mode one.
AV mode?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Good morning. For those of you who weren't here yesterday, today we're going to talk a little bit more about the burials we have in Giza specifically. Yesterday we talked a little bit more about osteology in general. And you haven't really heard much about that. And I don't have a lot about the actual site that we work on, the Old Kingdom site, because we don't have that much time today. But you probably heard about the lost city of the pyramids. It's all over National Geographic and Discovery Channel. We that work there, we like to call it Area A, but the National Geographic likes to call it Lost City of the Pyramids. What you never hear about is that on top of this Lost City of the Pyramids, there's actually a vast cemetery, because it's late period, so it's not as sexy. So you never hear about it in that they don't even mention it in the National Geographic special. But we have quite a few graves. And in fact, Giza has been a necropolis for a really, really, really long time. The first occupation we have is from the Mahdi culture, pre-dynastic, although we're not quite sure if it's funerary or domestic in nature. There was also some graves, some mastabas from the Archaic period here that were excavated by Petrie, Quibel, Daresi, and others. Of course, it's most famous for the 4th dynasty royal necropolis, which is, of course, what? The most visible part of which is what? The pyramids, exactly. So that's usually what people concentrate on. After the Old Kingdom, there's not really that much, at least not royal activity. It goes on a little bit for the non-elite or for the non-royals. We don't really have anything after that for a long time, except for an isolated false door of Imset Kai from the First Intermediate period, but it was found out of context. And there's also an 11th dynasty false door. And then, of course, there's the modern cemetery. So in between the 11th dynasty, there was a vast late period cemetery from 26th dynasty on, so Sayite period. And then it's been pretty much ongoing since. And it's important to remember it's not just the Muslim cemetery that you're looking at here. Right next to it is actually a Coptic cemetery. The Muslim cemetery in particular is ever growing. And it's kind of smack dab in the middle of the Giza Plateau and creates a bit of a problem for us when we come out every year and we notice it's gotten bigger. But it's important to remember that it's still in use today. So here is more of an overview. That's our site right there. Of course, you have the pyramids. You can't really miss them. The Sphinx. Here's the Muslim cemetery, and this high tree here is the Coptic one. Then you have the Old Kingdom cemetery, the 5th dynasty one, And this is our site. And you can sort of make out the galleries here. So basically what we're looking at is barracks for corvée labor, we think. So this is where the actual workmen who built the pyramids would have lived. Although we don't have anything from Khufu, our site is mainly Khafre and Menkaure. And that makes it really interesting because it's such a short time period the site was in use. That's about, what, 40 years or so, isn't it? The reigns of Khafre and Menkaure, so the two smaller pyramids. But again, that's not really why we're here today, even though that's really interesting, because I wanted to tell you about where we've excavated burials. And the biggest concentration is up here, at the end of the Wall of the Crow. And the Wall of the Crow is, we think, was sort of the limit between the sacred and the secular part of the plateau. So it has a gate in it, right there, probably where the workers would have had access to the sacred part of the plateau. And it's at the end of the Wall of the Crow, the eastern end of it, that we have the largest concentration of burials. They're very neatly dated, because in the lower layers we have 26th dynasty pottery, and on top we have 30th dynasty pottery. So in that area it was in use between 26th and 30th dynasty, it seems. We've also excavated the North Street Gatehouse, and we have all these designations because the site, you can't really see it here, but if you look at the scale, it's something like 8 football fields, so it's pretty big. The site basically is divided up: Main Street, North Street, and then we have a South Street down here, and then we number the different gallery systems. And another thing that's kind of interesting that we kind of touched on yesterday, I think, is that we have this really organized space here, and then you see this little line. It's sort of like a little worm here on the side. That's the Giza plateau wall that Zahi put in. That's where it goes. Because one day we were at work and they came with loaders and they said, oh, we're just going to dig a hole here with the front loader and then we're going to pour cement in it. And we said, don't do that. So Kevin and I were out surveying, actually. We were doing the surveying for that. And we managed to stop them long enough to where we could actually record what was in the trench. And then we realized that was before we excavated all that. We were only excavating up here back then. And then we realized that the architecture down here looked very different from the rest of the architecture on the site. So what we think is that the corvée labor, the unskilled workers, would be living in the barracks. And then perhaps there were craftsmen or administrators in the more organic-looking part of the town. And this is the Abul Hol Soccer Club. So we can't go in there. And this is Nasat el Saman. We can't go in there either. That's why it looks kind of funny like that. Anyway, that was a sidetrack on the Old Kingdom site. I digress. The earliest part of the cemetery site that we know from pottery is actually up here, and it has the prosaic name Western Dump, because we thought it was a dump. It turned out it wasn't, but the name stuck. Because here we have slightly nicer burials than on the rest of the site, and the pottery dates from 25th dynasty. Now there's overlap between the 25th and 26th dynasties, so they may be dated at approximately the same time as the earliest ones over by the Wall of the Crow. But I think that it might be part of a different cemetery. You can't see that from this flat map here, but there's a knoll there, which is why we thought it was a dump. And generally in ancient Egypt, the higher up your grave, the more status you have. And so that combined with the fact that these graves actually had more grave goods than any other graves on the site, makes me think that there may have been a separate cemetery perhaps for the not so poor people up the hill. But Zahi's concession starts pretty much here. So that's as far as we're going to get. Those are his bones. Last season we concentrated on this area and this area. And I'm going to have to digress a little bit more on the Old Kingdom thing, because I'm going to tell you something that I can't publish, but it's really cool. So you can't tell anyone that I said this. Let's see. This is just some example of the pottery. This is 25th dynasty jar, 30th dynasty up there. And we have a couple of these votive jars also that look kind of funky, the pilgrim flasks as well. And I'll get back to the Old Kingdom burial in a minute. We actually do have a few, maybe 15 Old Kingdom burials, but all in all, we've excavated over 400 late period ones. So the Old Kingdom ones are far and few between. In the late period material, we have a sex ratio of 116, which means that we're about 11% short of women. Now, that's not really statistically significant, since we haven't excavated the entire site. So we have pretty much even coverage, men and women. We have really low life expectancy if we just do calculations on the entire material. However, if you adjust the life expectancy for a natural growth rate, it comes up a little higher, 26 to 34 years of age. And the reason you do that, of course, is that if you do paleodemography on a cemetery material, you have a problem, because by definition, everyone is dead. And so it's a very static population. And so if you do calculations allowing for people to move in and out, you can adjust the natural growth rate. Gross mortality rate was 50.9, which is quite high. But a low percentage of infants, in general, from what you would expect in a material like this, gives us a pretty low reproduction rate. Now, this is because this is a pre-Jennerian society. They did not have penicillin or antibiotics or anything like that. So you would expect about 30% infant mortality rate. And we do not have that. We have something like 11%, which is fairly low. Now, this can be for a number of reasons. Infant bones, of course, are really small and fragile, and may not be preserved in the same extent as adult bones. They may have been buried in a different area. Even still, in some of the villages in southern Egypt, people sometimes bury infants under the floor of their houses rather than in the cemetery. And so that's probably a practice that dates back. So that could be one of the reasons. And also, we know that we have age-related variation on the site.
Before you go on, could you just define gross mortality rate?
Well, the gross mortality rate is how many people that die per 1,000 people, which is fairly high per year, which is fairly high here. So those are just statistics, because I need to put some numbers there so you can see that I've done some calculations. But I'm going to get to the juicy burials. I just gave you a few examples. Obviously, I can't talk about all of them because there's 400 of them. But let's see here. That's the Wall of the Crow right here. And again, just to orient you a little bit from the flat map that we had, you have the Sphinx up there. That's our site. This is Main Street. And here is the same map again. So you can see, if you go back, this knoll right here is where Zahi's cemetery is, the so-called cemetery of the workmen. That's the Coptic cemetery, and the Muslim one behind it. Oh, and then I have to go through this again. Sorry. But just to give you an idea, because this looks so flat, you don't really get the feeling of the knoll coming up here. But the site is right next to the Gebel, or the knoll. So it seems that most of our late period burials are concentrated here. We have the Old Kingdom burials mainly down further south. And like I said, it starts at the end of the Wall of the Crow, and it spreads out this way. And generally confined to that area and limited by the main street. And that's interesting because it suggests to us that the architectural features of the site were actually visible, at least to some extent, in the late period. Also, the late period grave diggers sometimes utilized existing structures. So they would use a wall, a mud brick wall from the Old Kingdom as part of the grave cut for a late period burial. And that tells us that they knew they were there. Now, even though I said this is the earlier cemetery, the earliest part of the cemetery, I still think that on the flat ground, I still think the end of the Wall of the Crow was the starting point, because you can sort of see how it's more condensed there. I think I have a picture there. And the next slide, maybe. So we have here 26th dynasty, and here we have Roman period. And remember we talked about yesterday that you don't always get to choose where you dig? Now, if I were doing the research design for this site, if I was the one who decided, and if we were doing research on the late period cemetery, I would like to dig here. Because I'm really interested in knowing, well, is there a separate 26th dynasty cemetery and then they stopped using it and they started using it again in the Roman period? Or is it a continual use and they just spread out? But because I think I started digging this area like 3 times or something like that, and Mark comes and pulls me off because he says, we really need to get the administrative building down here and there are bodies coming up. You need to come dig here instead. So that's a good example of how you don't always get to decide where you want to dig. I've been wanting to go back there since 2001, and I haven't managed yet. But we do have some Roman burials on top of the Wall of the Crow, but it's just 2 of them. They were in there with cattle offerings and some pottery, and I think those might just be isolated incidents because they were sort of in the sand that had covered the end of the Wall of the Crow in a later period. But I put that up there because I think she's cute, isn't she? Is an older lady. And we can tell he's Old Kingdom, of course, because of the body position. I'll show you a picture. Maybe you can see a little better. So the body position, you see he's been cut by a late period burial. That's why his head is kind of half, because they put in a late period burial perpendicular to him in a later, at a later time. And he's laying in a crouched position and he's oriented north-south. And so I thought that was really exciting. But I can't publish it because Zahi would get really mad. Generally, the preservation on our site, we talked about it yesterday, it's really poor. As you can see, this is one of the worst examples. I have better examples. But mainly, it's because of the groundwater level. And this has since become better. So here you can get a better idea of how massive the Wall of the Crow is. There's the Coptic cemetery again. And these are actually fake or new walls that we put in to see how they were affected by the water. So we actually put in some mud brick walls as part of an experimental archaeology program. And they've put in pumps now on the plateau, 2 of them I think, and it's actually helped. So the site is dry, at least on the surface, but of course the bones are basically still waterlogged. And so that's why I have so little organic preservation on the site. And also it's very acidic soil, which is not good for bone. And they don't seem to have been very thoroughly mummified either. So we're talking about a low status population here, not very much grave goods and not very much mummification. And so those things all weigh in. Again, you've seen this is one of our coffins. 54% of the burials had coffins, so pretty much half and half. And there's no difference between the sexes. However, there are certain coffin types that only occur with children. It seems to have been a square mud box with either a wood or some sort of fabric covering that hasn't survived. So we only have the little boxes left. Those only occur with children. The most common type we have are the painted, plastered mud coffins. And coffins also become more common with age. So it's not so much men get more coffins than women, but the older you get, you're more likely to have a coffin. Of course, the older you get, you're also more likely to have savings. So that's not so strange. Like I said, we have a really significant age-related variation as well. We have a really, really high incidence of children around the Wall of the Crow. So we have almost 60% of children and juveniles around Wall of the Crow, compared to 11% in the rest of the material. And so I find this really interesting because, again, we talked about a little bit yesterday how in medieval times, for example, they would put small children along the eavesdrops of the churches, along the church walls, to sort of give them more protection during the journey to heaven. And so you see in many cultures that children are sort of associated with larger structures to give them protection. The other thing we have is that we have almost all our amulets are from children's burials, with the exception of the richer burials in the Western Dump that I talked about earlier. Other than those burials that were a little bit nicer, all the amulets come from small children's burials. And again, you have the same thing there. We find amulets of Bess, Hathor, Taweret, all associated with family, children, childbirth. A lot of horse eyes, also for healing, perhaps. But I find that really interesting. And the other thing that's really interesting, that's completely unscientific, but that I just came up on by chance, is that they still use the Wall of the Crow today. And what they do is women will come to the Wall of the Crow, they will pay off our guards, and they will wait till we go home. Then they will come in on the side, climb up on the wall, urinate on a nail that was put in there by Reisner or someone, or Petrie, and then circumambulate this nail 3 times when they want to get pregnant. And so they will come from far away. And the reason we found out, and just for decency reasons, I actually have a photo of it because I took one with my cell phone, but I didn't think it was quite fair to put it up. We found out because there was this very determined woman who had come all the way from the Delta to pee on this nail because she really needed to get pregnant. And she didn't want to wait till those archaeologists went home. She paid our guards and she wanted her business for the money she paid. So she insisted and climbed up on the wall, and our guards are standing there. And so that's kind of how we found out about this racket. But I just find it interesting that because it's at the same end of the Wall of the Crow, it's not just anywhere. It's the east end of the Wall of the Crow, which is the same area where I have all these child burials. And so that's kind of interesting too. Otherwise, most of our burials are simple sand-filled pits. There are no visible grave markers, with a few exceptions, also in child burials, where they had put large rocks sort of at the head end of the grave. That could be, though, because the site has been covered over with sand, and then the sand has moved because it's windy. So I even have some burials that have been exposed. I can tell because the bone is weathered, even though the burial hasn't been looted. So when we do have burials that are preserved from the top down, they're usually 6 feet. Yeah, so they were using 6 feet under back then as well. But when I get to them, I have maybe 1.5 meters or something left. So there could well have been grave markers, except they're gone, either from, just the surface of the... and so the grave markers could be somewhere under the ring road as well, was my point that I was getting to. The adult burials, like I said, around 6 feet, if we have the whole surface preserved. The children's burials are also shallower, which could also be a reason for why we don't have so many children. Maybe they're also under the ring road. Sometimes we get a protective layer of limestones. And this is interesting because they occur somewhere, not in the earlier burials, but when they've been burying people there for a while. So just thinking about it, could be that the grave diggers were digging in and they realized that their they're digging up their grandparents when they're putting in new graves. And so they started putting in a layer of limestones in the middle of the grave, over the skeleton, so to speak, to sort of protect it. And like I said, also, some of the graves utilize pre-existing structures. For example, around the Wall of the Crow, we have a couple of burials around it, going just smack up to the surface of the wall. And this is just an example of these limestones, the layer of limestones that they would put into the grave. And what you see here are photocrosses, and that's part of how we record the burials, and I'll get to that in just a minute. But those metal things there are the photocrosses. Just another example of a coffin mask. This is a very young individual. So some of them can be quite nicely painted. And we also have some feathered headdresses. Usually the preservation is really bad. We can't really lift the burial or the coffin in one piece. And I've seen up the hill in Zahi's burials, and again, I can't publish it because it's Zahi's, but I've seen up there that they have the same type of coffin that holds together a lot better because it still has the wooden support. And this was cheap wood, acacia wood or something, or palm fronds or something like that. But what they would do is they would have that, and then they would put mud on both sides, finely levigated mud, then cover that with linen. We still have the imprints of the linen, and then paint on the linen. And basically what I'm left with is the paint that on the back has an imprint of linen, then a really thin layer of mud, about 2-3 millimeters thick perhaps, then a layer of sand that seeped in where I think there was wood to begin with, and then another layer of mud. And of course, as soon as you expose it, it starts cracking. So it's not just because Mark wants us to take these burials out in bulk, even though he does. It's also because the coffins and the bones start cracking as soon as they're exposed to sunlight. So once we've excavated them, they need to get out of the ground real quick. And so here's an example. This is actually one of the nicer coffins. This has a double coffin. So you see there's an inner coffin and actually a sarcophagus on the outside. And then you have sand inside because it's collapsed down the center. And this one also has a Hotep Dinisu formula, which you could only see if you had a magnifying glass. But it had a mask with a wig, with a headdress. They often have a wash collar. So this big, that would be sort of a copy of the floral garlands you can see on nicer burials. And this one also had the 4 sons of Horus, if you can see, painted on the side. So that's the side of the outer coffin. The outer coffin only had this geometric design and the sons of Horus, and the inner coffin had the Hotep Dinisu formula. You also get checkerboard patterns, as you can see there. Rosettes. Like I said, Hotep Dinisu formula, which is the standard offering formula, I should say to those of you who aren't Egyptologists. It means a vocation offering usually given to this person or to the king. I'm sorry, Hotep Dinisu was a vocation offering usually given to Osiris by the king for this person, which of course didn't really happen in real life, but it's the standard formula. Double coffins, as you saw, and here's an example of the rosette pattern that we also find. Okay, so we have orientation differences also in the burials. They usually head to the west, feet to the east, of course, so they could see the rising sun. But as you can see, most of our burials are out here. And the way this works is if you write down the orientation of the burial and you assume that they should be oriented east-west, straight, that's an assumption that you have to make, then the sun changes, or the sun doesn't change, the earth changes. But the angle of the sun is different in different seasons. So because it runs like this and back, spring and autumn is the same. So you can't differentiate between spring and autumn. So what we have here, which is kind of interesting, is that most of our burials died in the spring or autumn. And in other similar materials, like the ones from Saqqara that were investigated by Struhal, he actually has most of his people dying in the summer, which makes sense in a hot country like Egypt. Okay, so recording, that's because the machine was set up for Kevin. When he sets it up, he forgets that I'm not as tall as him, so I have to stand on a box. And this is actually the wall trench here behind me that I was talking about. This is when they dug down in there, and you see Nasat El Saman and all the stables behind it. We use the Sokia Geoset 3000 or Set 4000, which are total stations. On the rest of the site, we usually go for accuracy of 2 centimeters for top plans and such, because they're in 1 to 20. For the burials, however, if I want to put it into GIS, I need something like 3 millimeters. And so because we have this issue of the coffins and the skeletons cracking so quickly, what we do, well, I just put this in there. I prefer drawings. But a drawing like this probably takes you a whole day if you do it 1 to 5. So what we do is, you saw these photo crosses in the other picture, is that we take several photos and we only save the very center of the photo to minimize distortion. In the photo, in the actual grave, we've put out these photo crosses, so they're in the photo. Then we take coordinates with the total station, and we know where we are because we have a grid system on the site already set up, of course. Then we put it in MapInfo, which is the GIS that I use. We also use ArcView or ArcGIS, but they're compatible. This is easier to work with. And we stitch them together, because otherwise, if you take a photo straight down of a burial is going to be long like this. So you're going to have big distortion on the ends, the head and the feet, and you don't want that. So that's why we do that. And then we digitize them, and you end up with a drawing looking something like this. And so once you get it into the GIS, it georectifies itself. Then I can actually connect that to a database. And this is where it gets really fun for me, because I can create queries in my Access database, which is relational. So I can ask, for example, where are all the young men with trauma to the left arm? And then the GIS will bring up a map for me and show me where all those burials are. So this is an example here. This is our survey of the burials. So here I've asked the database, because we gave the survey burials a different kind of number to distinguish them, that they weren't excavated yet. So here I've asked the computer, show me all the burials that have a survey number, and it makes a map for me. And I think I'm going to get back to the survey a little later, but what you can see here, you can see how dense it is. There was, I think, you can see up there as well how many burials we have, the black ones at the end of the Wall of the Crow. I don't know why I'm doing that when I have a laser pointer. Up here, you can see how dense it is. Now, we dug down there. So what we see here, what we did was we surveyed every other line of squares. And then over here, there was so much wind-blown sand we couldn't really see on the surface. But here it was pretty clean. And so here you can see what we could see on the surface. And we found something like 700 some burials. Now, if you calculate that it's the same as up here, because up here we saw a few on the surface, but when we started digging, we ended up with 7 times as many. And we only did every other square, right? And we have 700 burials there. 7 times 7 is 49, times 2, because we only did every other burial, and then that's only half of the site as well. So we might be looking at as many as 12,000 burials in this area. You can see it's really, really dense. Oh, that was the blow-up that I was waiting for. Sorry. So you see up here how dense it is. And here you can also see the part of the mud brick gallery that the wall was built up to, that I was talking about. And these are burials that we actually excavated. And these are the ones that we surveyed in. And as you can see, this is where I started to go back and excavate, and then he pulled me away. So we have these outliers here and there. And those are the ones I got to before Mark moved me somewhere else. So I said we have burial goods, and we do. Mostly with the children's burials, like I said. With a few exceptions, such as this assemblage down here. And this is a really interesting one, too. This is from the area, the Western Dump. And she actually had more stuff. I just couldn't fit it in the picture. She had a little khatam, a little stamp. And she had all these big beads around her neck. And then topped off with this big amulet here. And this is a goddess named Hatmehit. She's pretty obscure. And she was a goddess from Mendes. And this is really interesting because that's one of the skulls that we had where we could actually run it through 4-disc and try and find where the biological affinity of this person was. And rather than matching with the Sayite material, which is part of the database for 4-disc, if you use Howell's populations for Egypt, he actually used a Sayite population from Giza as his base. And she didn't match it at all. She plotted a Central European. But with the amulet Hatmehit coming from Mendes, she may actually have been of Greek descent. Because during the Sayite period, there was a big influx of Greeks. You had these trading cities that were basically Greek cities in Egypt, like Mendes, Naucratis, so on and so forth. So it was quite interesting to me that both the amulets and the skeletal investigation showed the same thing. Here we have some Horus amulet, very stylized. They're not very good quality at all. There's another Horus eye up here, Wajid eye. This is, of course, Beth, the little dwarf leonine god. We find that in many of the children's burials as well. And Bastet, the cat goddess, also together with Hathor, and of course Horus. We also find quite a bit of pottery. And this was by far the richest pottery grave from last season. There ended up being 11 because there were several layers. So this is just one layer. And the coffin was actually put on top of these. So the pottery was sort of laid down as a bed. Now, there's nothing in these pots that we can see. If there was something in there, it must have been organic, but our paleobotanist has looked at it. She can't find any seeds. So if there were any seeds in there, they weren't burnt. However, we did find a mice skeleton in a couple of them. So there might have been food. And what's interesting here is that part of this was actually reused. We had a bit of a hard time with the stratigraphy for this one. As you can see, this one is broken, and there's another grave here. Well, the individual that was in this grave had its head in this pot. And so originally we thought that this pot was, belonging to that grave, and we just didn't dig far enough. But what they did was they accidentally broke it, and they go, oh, there's a nice container here. Let's use that to protect the head. So this was actually reused in this burial as well, which is later than that one. And all of this is 26th dynasty, late period pottery. These big torpedo jars that you can see in, for example, the Syrio-Palestinian archaeology. You often find children, and in Greek, on some Greek sites as well, you find children put in jars like this, but we don't have anything like that on our site. Okay, so you saw this one, those of you who were there yesterday, just to show you a few of the burials we have on the site. This one was interesting to me because he was in a coffin, and when we opened the coffin up, the coffin was really little. And we opened the coffin up, there was an adult in there. But if you look here, this is his sacrum, which is the bone you have right here. So his sacrum is basically between his knees, and his hand is also on his knee, even though the arm is stretched out. And when we looked at the vertebra here, he had cut marks on his thoracic vertebra. So this body was cut up and squished together to fit in the coffin. And so this tells us that the coffins were made elsewhere. Even though they look kind of crappy, they probably weren't at the time. And They would have been made elsewhere and not around the body, because if you were making it around the body, it wouldn't give you any reason to cut up the body to fit the coffin. You would make the coffin fit the grave. Also, of course, they're painted on the underside, which also tells us they were made somewhere else. This is another one. And you can see here it also had that checkerboard pattern. The coffin are the green lines on top there. I'll take the coffin away. Now, this here is a tibia. And that's two more tibias. And then this person also had its own tibias. And so instead of a vertebral column, there was a lower leg bone. And as you can see, the sacrum is missing. And so some of the parts of this individual are missing, but then again, they put in parts of other individuals to sort of make up for that. And during the late period, mummification was becoming a big business, particularly with animal votive mummies. But they seem to have had large areas where they would mummify many bodies at once. And so it's possible that they lost pieces of this person, because from what we know, they used tent structures. They used ibu tents, from what we know. And no one has ever found any area of mummification related to humans. They've found it related to the Apis bulls, but never to humans. And so it seems it wouldn't have been a permanent structure, more something like a tent or a reed building, perhaps, because you'd want to put it somewhere away from where people lived and hung out, because it would have been smelly. And those of you who have been excavating the Coptic mummies, you know they're still smelly today. And so it's possible if they had a tent that an animal got in and perhaps scavenged pieces of a body, or that, pieces fell off and they didn't notice immediately, and then they're like, oh dear, I've got a pair of extra legs, what do I do with them? Oh, we'll stick them in this mummy because they'll never know, we'll wrap them up. Because since you left the body with the embalmer, embalming was not something you did at home. The embalmers were sort of a separate part of society that were almost like untouchables, because they were dealing with cutting people up. And so that's an example of an interesting burial. Here's just a photo, so here you can see the tibia. There's no sacrum, and then these are the tibias of the other person. Now we've already started lifting the burial here, but just to give you a clear idea. Last year we also found an interesting votive burial with a whole bunch of dogs. And this is also interesting because it's one of the first for Giza. There are a couple of pet dogs from the Old Kingdom that seem to have been buried with the elite. Among one, I think, was Khufu's dog. But here you can see they've been mummified. And in the color-coded here, you see the different layers of the dog. So we had two mummified ones, and then we had another one underneath, and another one underneath, and then the orange pieces are 4 puppies. And just briefly, another interesting thing. And of course, dogs would have been sacred to Anubis, the god of at the moment, and the Khentkhawas pyramid complex that has a little pyramid town attached to it. And again, that's not my area. I'm not Old Kingdom archaeologist. But there were burials in there too. And we had one that was really interesting. She was found here in this corridor. We called her the falling woman because that's what she was. And here's a picture. You can see it seems like she fell down and just ended up like that. And this was on the side of a high wall. And then when we started lifting the burial, we realized this is her tibia. And so she had really, 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 really severe osteomyelitis, which is an infection of the medullary cavity in her tibia. And so this would have been fatal eventually with no antibiotics. So we don't know if she was out walking in the desert and just got overwhelmed by septicemia and fell down that hole. Because as you can see, this does not seem to have been an intentional burial like what we talked about yesterday. It seems to have been an accident who left this woman there. And we don't really know the dating either. Okay. Let's see. I just had a few more pictures of trauma. This one here has the femurs turned inwards. So if you can see, the top of the femurs is normal, but the knees are turned 90 degrees. So he would have had to walk like this. But he still reached a high age, and someone must have probably cared for him. And then just the last thing I want to show you is not that, but this is a really interesting one. See, this is a child, and I'm just showing you this because the picture isn't, this is a couple of years old and my digital camera wasn't as good back then. But that's the orbitus. There were no cheekbones, and this is where you would expect the skull to be on a child this size. And so this is some sort of microcephalic child, or perhaps porencephalic. But the teeth of this child points to an age of about 18 months. So somehow they kept this child alive, and it was also buried with grave goods. So someone obviously cared for this person. But if you have a problem with your brain case like that, you probably wouldn't have had more than a reptile brain. So maybe for swallowing, breathing, but not much else. So that just shows us that they cared for their sick. So we have low life expectancy and high infant mortality compared to today, not compared to what we would have expected back then. Low reproduction ratio. Substandard diet, we can see that from Cribororbitalia and animal hypoplasia like we talked about yesterday. A lot of arthritic changes. Looks like they had a hard life. Trauma only in the men, almost, which suggests difference in lifestyle. Some of the trauma seems to have been tended to, so they may have had access to medical care. And also they were caring for the weaker individuals. And just one more thing about the arthritic changes. What's interesting there is we also have a difference. The women have it in the neck and the men have it in the lower body. Now, why would you think that would be? Well, if you go to Egypt, you'll see these women on the streets still carrying these heavy things on their head. And so that seems to have been the pattern in the late period as well. And finally, fairly equal in death as far as grave goods go. So what I'm interested in now, of course, is who were the people that were buried here, and we're going to talk about that tomorrow. And I want to look at the material culture and the history of the site as well to get the context of the burial population. For the health, it's interesting to look at the evolution of health throughout through the Roman period. I'm also interested in migration and exogamy, but I don't think I'll be able to do that because Zahi won't let me take any bones out to test them. But I'm interested in it. But mainly, these bones represent the voices of people that were rarely or never heard otherwise in the archaeological record, because we were talking about a low-status population that didn't leave any monuments or any written sources behind. So what we have are the bones, and hopefully that can help us understand the people that were buried here a little better. So thank you very much. That's all I had for today. I hope I didn't pull over too much, did I?